As you can see, today's message is about revengeance, and it wasn't just some word that I made up, a combination of revenge and vengeance. It's actually a word that you can find in Webster's dictionary, although it happens to be the 1913 version of Webster's dictionary. But I like that particular dictionary. It's the last Webster's dictionary that really tried to make application to words out of the Bible and define them and keep those words active and used in everyday's vocabulary at the time. So I still sometimes consult that dictionary. It's a particular favorite of mine, and you'll find the word revengeance in that dictionary. As you know, I tend to be more topical in terms of things that I pick to discuss with you. It's typically a reflection of what I'm going through. At some point in time, maybe I'll change my strategy and we'll go more book by book or chapter by chapter. But for some reason, this week was kind of on my mind. Our political discourse has changed a lot, I think. This past week was Robert Mueller's testimony based upon this 2-year report. And we don't advocate politics here. So it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. What I do know is that because of Robert Mueller and his testimony and the report, it's just gotten everybody all wound up, one way or the other. Either Mr. Mueller said stuff that's incriminating, or Mr. Mueller said stuff that can be largely ignored. It doesn't matter what camp you're in, it's just the dialogue in our nation has seemingly ratcheted up. And so I got to thinking about that and picked revengeance as the topic. And it just so happens, as you hear through the message, there were some other incidents going on in my life at the time that made this an interesting lesson to write. But it's taken from Proverbs chapter 20, verse 22. Now don't say, I'll pay you back for the wrong you did. Wait for the Lord, and he will make things right. So as I was writing this message this week, I was angry. I was angered by all things frogs. That particular evening, they were loud. They were absolutely obnoxious. They were in my swimming pool, and they were going to be in big trouble if I could get my hands on these frogs. Because I was up late. It was probably later than I should have been while I'm writing this message. But my sleeves at the time were rolled up, my laptop is humming, I'm kind of on a roll. I wanted to get a jump on this. I had planned on getting a leg up. I had hoped on maybe preparing a little sooner rather than later. But at that point in time, getting my hands on those frogs was what I was mumbling to myself. And I don't have anything against nature. The melody of songbirds, I think, is really beautiful. But the evening ribbiting of the frogs just really bugged me. So I went outside to see what I could do. Now, at my home, we're blessed to having a swimming pool. And at the deep end of our swimming pool is a rock grotto with a rock slide. And that's where the frogs were. There could have been maybe half a dozen, as many as I could see, so maybe there were 6 of them. And these frogs are like 3 inches long. But they're each equipped with a 10-foot foghorn. They are enormously loud. And when they're inside the grotto, with these foghorn croaks, it sounds like there are 1,000,000 frogs. So I turn the water on that leads into the pool in hopes of disturbing them. And for a moment, it's quiet. And then they start again. So then I turn on the waterfall that spills over the top of the grotto into the pool and comes also down the slide. And there was silence for a moment. Because I finally figured out they're frogs, Randy. You cannot drown frogs. So at this point in time, I'm tired, I am humbled, and I've been sabotaged now by an army of amphibians. I have literally been reduced to a frog stalker. So at the time, I wanted the reader of these messages, because I sent them out in addition to preaching them. I wanted people to understand that at the time my thoughts were a little fragmented, but it seemed like I was launching an artillery against these frogs like every other paragraph. So I'd go inside, I'd write a little bit, and I'd go outside and deal with the frogs, thinking they were done. Go back inside. So like every other paragraph, it's like I'm going outside and then inside. Because the pool is just outside of a study of mine at home. And this was really no way for me to be working at all. This was not really a way that I wanted to end my day. I mean, my space in my head is now being cluttered by all this noise. My pants are wet. My train of thought's been derailed. And I got to thinking, I mean, how can you write about revengeance when a bunch of stupid frogs are croaking for their collective love lives in my swimming pool? And then it occurred to me, I was in the right frame of mind, because I wanted my revengeance on those frogs. And so for me, that particular night, it was easy to define. Revengeance is this noise of the soul. Revenge is this unseen irritant of the heart. Vengeance is this relentless invader of silence. And just like the frogs, revengeance irritates. Just like the frogs, vengeance isn't easily silenced. And just like the frogs, revengeance has a way of increasing the volume until it's the only sound we hear. The louder it gets, the more desperate we become. When we are mistreated in this world, our animalistic tendencies start rising to the surface, because it means that we need to go on the hunt. Instinctively, we double up our fists because getting even is the natural thing to do. But that's the problem, church. That's the natural thing to do. Revengeance is natural. It's not spiritual. Getting even is the rule of the jungle. Giving grace is the rule of the kingdom. But maybe some of you are thinking, well, Randy, that's so easy for you. I mean, if your biggest problem in life is dealing with croaking frogs, then you just do not understand. I mean, you ought to try living with my husband, or you ought to have to try coping with my past, or you have no idea how hard my life has been. And you know what? You're right. I don't. But I do have an idea about how miserable your future is going to be unless you deal with the anger that spawns revengeance. If you x-ray the soul of a vengeful person, you'll see this tumor of bitterness. It's black, it's menacing, it's malignant, it's a carcinoma of the spirit. Its fatal fibers start creeping around the edges of your heart and gradually ravage it until there's nothing left. Yesterday, we can't alter, but our reaction today to yesterday's events, we can. Our past, we can't change, but our response to our past, we can. And that seems impossible, but it's not. And here's why. Imagine that you come from a very, very large family, maybe a dozen or so kids, a family that is more blended than the Brady Bunch, let's say. All the children in this particular family are from the same father, but they have 4 or 5 different moms. Imagine also that your dad is as dishonest as they come, and he has been for a very, very, very long time. Everybody knows that your dad is a thief. Everybody knows that your dad cheated your uncle out of your uncle's estate. Everybody knows that your dad ran like a coward to avoid getting caught by the rest of the family. Let's also imagine in your family that your great uncle tricked your dad into marrying your mother's sister. Do you follow that? Your great uncle tricked your father into marrying your mother's sister. And how that happened is he got drunk before the wedding and had his less fortunate looking daughter go to the altar instead of the pretty one that your dad thought that he was marrying. That didn't slow your dad down, however. He just ended up marrying them both. The one he loved couldn't have kids, so he slept with her maid. In fact, he had a habit of sleeping with most of the help. As a result, a number of your brothers and sisters look like the cooks. Finally, the bride your dad wanted to marry in the first place gets pregnant. Voila! You are born. You're the favored son. Your brothers know it. You get a car, they don't. You get Armani, they get Kmart. You get summer camp, they get summer jobs. You get educated, they get angry. And then your brothers get even. They sell you to some foreign service organization, put you on a plane bound for Egypt, and tell your dad that you were murdered by Al-Qaeda. You find yourself surrounded by people you do not know, learning a language you do not understand, and living in a culture you have never, ever experienced in your life. Am I just making up this story? No, I'm not. It's the story of Joseph in the Bible. He is the favored son in this bizarre family who had every reason to be angry. Joseph had every reason to seek revengeance. He tried to make the best of it, though. He became the chief servant of the head of the Secret Service. But his boss's wife tried to seduce him. He refused, and so she pouts and he goes to jail. Pharaoh got wind of the fact that this Joseph kid could interpret dreams and let him take a shot at some of Pharaoh's own dreams he was having. When Joseph interpreted them, he got promoted out of prison and into the palace as the prime minister. Joseph was the second in command to the most powerful man on the planet. The only person that Joseph would bow down to was the Pharaoh. Meanwhile, back in Israel, a famine has hit. And Jacob, who is Joseph's father, sends his sons to Egypt to essentially obtain a foreign loan. It's kind of like Greece and the EU several years ago. The brothers don't know it, but they're standing in front of the same brother they had sold to the gypsies some 22 years earlier. They don't recognize Joseph. But Joseph recognizes them. A bit balder, a bit punchier, Joseph is thinking, but they're the same brothers. Now, I want you to imagine Joseph's thoughts. The last time that Joseph had seen these faces, he was looking up at them from the bottom of a pit. The last time he had heard his brothers' voices, they were laughing at him. And the last time his brothers called him a name, they called him anything other than Joseph and called him every name in the book. You see, now is Joseph's chance to get even. He has complete control. One snap of his fingers, and his brothers are dead men. Better yet, maybe slap some manacles onto their hands and onto their ankles. Let them see what an Egyptian dungeon is like. Let them sleep in the mud. Let them mop the floors. Let them learn Egyptian. Revengeance is easily within Joseph's power, and their church is power in revengeance. It's intoxicating. I can get you back. Have you ever tasted it before? Haven't we been tempted to get even before? As we escort the offender in our lives into the courtroom, we announce, "He hurt me." And the jurors shake their heads in disgust. "He abandoned me." We explain, and the chambers in this scene that we have in our mind, they echo with the fact, "He's guilty." The judge snarls as he slams down the gavel, "Guilty." The jury agrees, "Guilty." We delight in that moment of justice, guilty. And we relish that pound of flesh. So we prolong the event, don't we? And we tell the story over and over and over and over again. Now freeze frame that scene and let me ask you a question. And at the time it was really for me, not for you. I'm in the courtroom of complaint. I'm rehashing the same hurt every chance I get with anyone who will listen. But who made me God anyway? Why am I doing God's work for him? The writer of the Hebrew letter says, "Look, vengeance is mine," God declares. "I will repay." Hebrews chapter 10, verse 30. Don't say, "I'll pay you back for the wrong you did." Wait for the Lord, and he will make things right. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 22. You see, church, judgment is God's job. To assume otherwise is to assume that God can't do his job. Revengeance then is irreverent. When we strike back, we are saying essentially, "I know that vengeance is yours, God, but I just didn't think you would punish this person enough. I thought I'd better take this situation into my own hands. After all, you have a tendency to be just a little soft." Joseph understood all of that. But rather than get even, he reveals his identity and has his father and the rest of the family come to Egypt to live. In fact, Joseph gives them property upon which to raise their family in Egypt. Joseph gives them safety. Joseph provides for them a place to live and food to eat. They live in harmony for 17 years. But then Jacob dies, and the moment of truth for the sons now starts to settle in on them, because the brothers have a hunch that with Jacob now gone and out of the scene, they'll be lucky to get out of their places in Egypt with their heads on their shoulders. So they go to Joseph and they plead for mercy. And it says in Genesis chapter 15, verses 16 through 17, the following: "Your father," referring to Jacob, "gave this command before he died. Tell Joseph to forgive you." Do you need a translation for that? What he's saying is, Daddy said to be nice to us. Joseph has been abandoned by his brothers for 22 years, has risen to a place of prominence, is now living peaceably and in harmony with his family for another 17 years. And these brothers, after their daddy dies, says, Joseph, Daddy said, be nice to us. You know what Joseph's response was? In Genesis chapter 15, verse 17, it says, when Joseph received that message, he cried. What more do I have to do? His tears are imploring them. I've given you a home. I've provided for your families. Why do you still mistrust my grace? And I want you to carefully read these two verses. These are two statements that Joseph makes to his brothers. This is the Joseph that should have had revengeance in spades. I think if you read through his story, you can pretty much see, if anybody had a reason to be vengeful, it would probably have been Joseph. But look, read carefully the two statements that he makes to his brothers. What's the first one that he says? Can I do what only God can do? Let me restate the obvious. Revengeance belongs to whom? God. If vengeance is God's, then it's not ours. God hasn't ever asked you or me to settle the score or to get even. Ever. And do you know why? The answer to that question is in the second part of Joseph's statement. You meant to hurt me, but God turned your evil into good to save the lives of many people, which is being done. You see, church, forgiveness comes much better with a wide-angle lens. Joseph, in speaking to his brothers, who had all the reason to be revengeful, said, first of all, it's not my job, and number two, you had no idea that despite what you were doing, which was trying to hurt me, God worked it out far differently. And Joseph, with some maturity and with some age, is now looking at his life and sees it from a much wider perspective. And Joseph uses one to get the whole picture. He refuses to focus on the betrayal of his brothers without also seeing the loyalty of his God. Church, it always helps to see the bigger picture. You see, when we forgive someone, we're actually admitting that we also have our own limitations. We've been only given one piece of life's jigsaw puzzle. And only God has the cover to the box, right? You've put together jigsaw puzzles. If you really want to challenge yourself, get a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and don't use the cover of the box. How long will it take you to put together that puzzle? A long time. But if you have that same 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and you have the box cover, then you know where all the shades go, and you know where all the colors go, and you know where all the design goes. Well, you know what, church? We're one of the 1,000 pieces in the box. And we live life sometimes in a box, and we get all jumbled up, and we get dumped out on a table with all the other pieces, and we do not have a clue as to how we fit into that picture. But God does, because He has the box. He has the cover. He has the picture. He knows what He intends. And that's what Joseph is trying to tell his brothers. Look, you meant this for evil, but God intended it for good. And you know what? God is so good, He intended it for good, not just for you, but for everybody. They've been in a famine for 7 years. By the time they get to this point, and Joseph has this statement, these people have been without crops that grew for 6 years. Nations were flooding into Egypt because they're all starving. And Joseph's view of the situation is, although you intended it for evil, God intended it for good. And look who it's benefiting, not just you, but the worlds who are coming to Egypt's doorstep to receive grace and to receive help. To forgive someone is to display reverence. Forgiveness is not saying that the hurt and the one who hurt you was right. It's not. Forgiveness is simply stating that God is fair and he will do what is right. After all, when you think about it, don't we all kind of have enough on our plate without doing God's job too? And then as I was finishing my lesson, I noticed something. The frogs. Remember the frogs? They're quiet. They're not ribbiting anymore. Apparently, I got so wrapped up in writing this lesson that I had forgotten about them. And I hadn't thrown anything at them or done anything to them for like the last hour. And I thought, well, maybe they fell asleep. And you know what? Maybe that's all they wanted all along. But I kept waking them up by turning on the water and turning on the shower coming out from over the grotto, the waterfall. Maybe they finally ended up getting some rest, and it was me that was creating the problem, that all they wanted was to get some shut-eye, and I kept disturbing their rest. They finally ended up getting the rest that they were seeking, and I finally ended up finishing my thoughts. It is remarkable to me what gets accomplished when we give up our need for revengeance. Rabbit. I'm not kidding you. They are like this long. They are this long. And it is as annoying as I can try and describe for you. But this past week, I was in a mood. The Mueller testimony and people getting all sanctimonious on either side of the equation and just wanting to say hurtful things and get back. And I'm thinking, man, that's just a crazy world in which to live. And so I started writing this lesson, and then this happened. And I thought, well, that's God just kind of helping me along in my writing. In church, we live in a political climate these days where people say hurtful things. We live in a religious climate in which people say hurtful things. We fortunately live in a country that at least is not currently undergoing an extraordinary amount of persecution being a Christian. But there are other parts of this world where people are losing their lives for confessing their belief in Jesus. And there are steps being taken here in the United States from time to time that you just wonder where it's going. And sometimes as Christians, we want to just get back. God, you need to do your job. Obviously, you're taking a siesta, so here, let me help you. Because you just have a habit of being too nice and too forgiving and too graceful. I need to really lay into this person. And so we take matters into our own hands. And it seldom works out. But if we can take a page out of Joseph's book, knowing what he went through, and yet then knowing that he had the maturity of the perspective to say with his brothers, look, you intended this for evil. We're not kidding anybody here. But God chose it for good. And he's doing good for our family, and he's doing good for the world. That's the wide-angle lens that I would like to encourage you this week to have. That when things start boiling up inside and you're feeling a little angry about the circumstances, make sure that you have the picture of the puzzle box. Because you may not know all the pieces. You may not know what's driving people to make those statements or those comments. There might be a lot of stuff going on in their lives where a graceful response from you would do so much for them, as opposed to a revengeful word or act from you which will do nothing more than isolate them even further. So think about Joseph this week. I try and use word pictures. You can think about the frogs if you'd like. But whatever you do, as sometimes you get piqued to try and get back at that person, step back if you would. Put on the wide-angle lens and think that God is in control and that he has the cover to the box and he is working out good in our lives. So we picked a song, Angry Words. Oh, let them never from the tongue unbridled slip. May the heart's best impulse ever check them ere they soil the lip. Let's see if we can sing this song, mean it, and then if you have any prayer requests, you can hand them up. We'll pray over those, then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand, let's sing.